Message from Goodwill Imagine.
You're listening to BostonFreeRadio.com.
Hello and welcome to Words on Film, the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures. I'm your host and movie critic Dan Burke, and Words on Film is a show to which you are listening on BostonFreeRadio.com and WBCA-LP Boston, watching on Somerville Community Access Television or some community access TV station that's kind enough to pick up this broadcast, and then I say thank you as always. Or you are watching and listening to me on Facebook Live, either on my own personal page or on Boston Free Radio's Facebook page. Either way you could join me. I'm glad you could join me to discuss my favorite topic, which is movies. And this week we have 5 movies that I'm going to review for you. But first, I'm going to get started with my usual segment, which is What's Topping the Box Office? The top 10 highest grossing films of this past weekend. And something is really phenomenal here. Usually, the top 10 varies from week to week, but this week, 5 out of the 10 spots are exactly the same as they were last week. I'm not making this up. The number one movie last week was Halloween. Guess what's the number one movie for this week? As I predicted last week, it is indeed Halloween, which grossed $31.4 million at the domestic box office this weekend. The domestic box office including Canada. It's the USA and Canada. Not Mexico, interestingly enough, but enough on that. So against a budget of $10 to $15 million, Halloween has grossed so far $126.1 million domestically, and internationally it has grossed $172.1 million, making it a certified hit here in the States and around the world, which I guess is to be expected considering this is the weekend before Halloween. So it might be number one at the box office next week, but considering that the Queen biopic is coming out this coming weekend, and a number of other films, including the one about the Nutcracker, which is for Disney, is coming out too. It is unlikely that Halloween will be number one next week, but we'll see it in the top 10 for at least 2 weeks, I would imagine. A Star is Born, number 2 at the box office last week, number 2 at the box office this week, having grossed just $14 million at the U.S. box office, but in its 4 weeks in release, it has not dipped below number 5 yet. In fact, I don't think it's even dipped below number 2 yet. Maybe it was number 3 at one point. I can't quite recall. But in any event, A Star is Born against a budget of $36 to $40 million. So far, in the States and Canada, grossed $148.6 million, and around the world it has grossed $254.6 million, making it a certified hit here in the States and around the world. Venom, number 3 at the box office last week. Guess what it is this week? It is also number 3, having grossed $10.7 million domestically. Against a budget ranging from $100 to $116 million, Venom has so far grossed $187.1 million here at home, and around the world it has grossed $508.2 million, making it a tentative hit here at home, and all around the world it is a certified hit. Now it has a very long way to go to catch up with Black Panther and Avengers Infinity War, which I don't think it will do, but it's still making some very impressive money, especially given its competition. Goosebumps 2, Haunted Halloween, number 4 at the box office last week. This week, it is also number 1, having grossed $7.3 million in the last weekend before Halloween. Against a budget of $35 million, which is actually pretty modest, Goosebumps 2 has so far grossed $38.1 million here at home and $62.3 million around the world, making it a tentative hit here at home and around the world. And the number 1 highest grossing debut movie of the week actually debuted at number 5. It is Hunter Killer, starring Gerard Butler and Gary Oldman, which is one of the 5 movies I'll be reviewing for you for this show. This weekend, it only grossed $6.7 million here at home against a budget of $40 million. Around the world, it has so far grossed $10.7 million, which means even though it's in the top 5 in its debut, it doesn't look like this movie is going to do well. But then again, I could be wrong. The Hate U Give is the last movie in the top 10 that actually did was in the same spot last week as it is this week. Last week is number 6. This week it is also number 6, having grossed $5.1 million at the domestic box office. Against a budget of $23 million, though, The Hate U Give has so far grossed $18.3 million here at home and $19.6 million around the world, which means it's not a hit here in the States and Canada or around the world, but it is getting that way. And this $5.1 million is actually a record for The Hate U Give, and it could go up. We'll, of course, have to see. First Man is a movie that's been doing really well critically, but not so well commercially. This week, it is number 7, dropping from number 5 last week, having grossed $4.9 million here at home, against a budget of $59 to $70 million, somewhere in that range. First Man has so far grossed $37.8 million here at home and $75.2 million worldwide. So that makes it a tentative hit around the world, but here at home, it is not a hit yet. And at number 7, it's not looking particularly good, but then again, Oscar season is coming up, so we might see this film rebound. Of course, we'll have to see. Smallfoot is number 8 at the box office, sliding slightly from number 7 last week, having grossed $4.8 million at the domestic box office. Against a budget of $80 million, Smallfoot has so far grossed $72.6 million here at home and $167.6 million worldwide, making it not a hit yet here at home, but around the world, it is already a certified hit, as you would probably expect from an animated movie. Night School, starring Kevin Hart and Tiffany Haddish, is number 9 at the box office, sliding slightly from number 8 last week, having grossed $3.2 million at the domestic box office. Against a budget of $29 million, Night School has so far grossed $71.4 million here at home and $90.6 million around the world, making it a certified hit here in the States and around the world, despite not being a critical darling per se. But either way, it's a win for both Kevin Hart and Tiffany Haddish, which means we might see a sequel to this, or we'll definitely see Kevin Hart and Tiffany Haddish in future movies. They're hot right now. And finally, at number 10 at the box office is Mid-90s, which was not in the top 10 last week. This weekend, it had a more elaborate release, and it grossed a decent $3 million at the box office, domestic box office this weekend, and a total of $3.3 million here in the States and Canada. I don't have the budget information or how much it's grossed internationally, so I can't tell you what kind of hit it is.
I'm voting in the midterm elections because
my constitutional right,
because my ancestors died,
to make it better for my children.
The women before me fought
so we can remain free.
helping your community out.
Midterm election.
I know every vote makes a difference.
My opinion matters.
I vote.
I vote.
I vote in the midterm election.
Register now on IamAvoter.com. And don't forget to vote Tuesday, November 6th.
Brought to you by I Am a Voter and the Ad Council.
Never Stop the Madness. Tuesdays at 9 p.m. BostonFreeRadio.com.
Welcome back to Words on Film, the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures. I'm your host and movie critic, Dan Burke. The first movie I'm going to be reviewing for you is the highest grossing debut movie of this week, which is Hunter Killer, which is a submarine movie, but not a particularly interesting one. It's one about an untested American submarine captain, who's played by Gerard Butler, who teams with the U.S. Navy SEALs to rescue the Russian president, who has been kidnapped by a rogue general. Now, it sounds like an enticing plot, especially from a story that Tom Clancy probably would have written if he were alive, but it's actually based on a novel called Firing Point, which was written by George Wallace and Don Keith. It was adapted into a screenplay by Arnie Schmidt and Jamie Moss, and the movie is directed by Donovan Marsh, who is a relatively young director, and so far he's actually directed a couple of films, none of which I've actually seen. He directed one movie called Spud, which actually was popular enough to have a sequel, and it takes place in South Africa, but it's about actually private school kids. I haven't seen that one. He also directed another movie called Avenged, which came out in 2013, which probably got lost in the shuffle because its name looks a lot like Avengers. But Hunter Killer is his first mainstream film, and it's not a great start, particularly because the movie is a lot of retread. I was watching this film and I just kept thinking this is The Hunt for Red October with far less interesting characters. And a lot of the fault lies not only in the hackneyed storyline, which goes over a lot of military tactics and foreign espionage that we've seen before in other films, particularly ones involving the character Jack Ryan from Tom Clancy, but also Gerard Butler in the lead role wasn't particularly interesting, particularly because there's nothing unique about Gerard Butler's performance in this film. As a matter of fact, one of my most chief complaints with Gerard Butler is in every other movie he's done besides 300, he looks listless and bored. And this movie is certainly no exception. It has a really good start, the movie does, when it shows an American submarine that vanishes and is presumably hit by a missile. And so Gerard Butler is a commander by the name of Joe Glass, who takes over commanding duties of the USS Arkansas, which is another submarine, to search for this American submarine that goes missing. And then eventually they find the submarine and then find that they have to rescue the Russian president under the orders of Admiral Charles Donegan, who's played in this movie by Gary Oldman. But then actually Gerard Butler's character is one that the high-ranking military officials, including Rear Admiral John Fisk, who's played in this movie by Common, underestimate simply because he doesn't have a degree from West Point. So he's one of these captains who I guess is hired because the other foreign leaders don't know who he is, and maybe they're just taking a risk on a rogue maverick submarine captain, which could be an interesting plot if it hadn't been done before. But again, I give credit to actors in this movie like Gary Oldman, Common, and Linda Cardellini, who actually look like they're invested in this movie. But unfortunately, they're not the lead actors in this film. Gary Oldman is second in terms of being... He's listed second in this movie, but the lead actor is Gerard Butler, and as I've said before, Gerard Butler does not look invested in this film at all, especially in scenes where the submarine gets hit and it starts leaking, and other members of the ship are understandably panicked but still focused on what they need to do. Gerard Butler himself looked decidedly unfocused, which, as I was watching this, I was thinking, why are people still putting Gerard Butler in movies, particularly in the lead role? I mean, he was a big mistake to cast in Gods of Egypt, not only because it's a movie that takes place in Egypt and is about Egyptian gods, yet the Egyptian gods are played by white people. That's bad enough. But the fact that Gerard Butler looks like he just wandered onto the set drunk and acted like he wandered onto the set drunk was just inexcusable. Even though his character is supposed to be listless, Gerard Butler is just playing these characters with no passion whatsoever. And it doesn't necessarily upset me, but I would imagine that if I were an actor in Los Angeles trying to make it, and I just see Gerard Butler starring in these films while putting no effort in, I would be furious. I would imagine that actors would all come together and start marching down Hollywood Boulevard to demand that Gerard Butler, if he doesn't want to be in a movie, which he doesn't seem to do, should just get the hell out of films. As a matter of fact, I think Gerard Butler is on my list of actors very much like Jamie Dornan in terms of actors that probably should not be acting because A, they're not good enough, and or B, they just don't put in the effort. But Gerard Butler isn't the only weak link in this film. He's just amongst the weakest. And not even the title of this movie, Hunter Killer, was intriguing enough. Again, when I hear Hunter Killer, I don't think military film or submarine film. In fact, it's based on a novel called Firing Point. And the reason they probably didn't call this movie Firing Point was because another movie probably held the copyright for that. But even still, Hunter Killer isn't an accurate title for this movie, and it's not even really a memorable title for any movie, let alone one that takes place on a submarine. So Hunter Killer is retread with a lead actor that doesn't seem to want to be there, and maybe even doesn't really seem to want to be in films in general. It's not a terribly acted film, but it gets my rating of a strikeout because it's not original, it's not memorable, and Gerard Butler does not do anything to make this film unique in any way. I give kudos to the actors I mentioned before, Gary Oldman, Common, and Linda Cardellini, amongst others, for at least trying to make this less than formulaic, but unfortunately, not even their acting efforts can save this film. So, Hunter Killer is a film that really just sinks and never really seems to rise to any occasion, if you will allow me to use any submarine puns that fit.
911, what is your emergency?
My kid shot himself.
All right, where's the wound, sir?
911, what's your emergency?
Please help. My son shot his brother. I don't know.
Okay.
Every day, 8 kids and teens are unintentionally killed or injured by loaded and unlocked guns.
It wasn't locked.
Learn how to make your home safer at endfamilyfire.org. Brought to you by the Ad Council and End Family Fire.
I love those real 6 sons. They're the ones that move me. The thinly blow, neurotic tone. Intensify and groove me.
All this and more on Unpopular Music. Saturdays at noon on Boston Free Radio.
Welcome back to Words on Film, the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures. I'm your host and movie critic, Dan Burke. The next movie I'm going to be reviewing for you is Mid-90s, which is the directorial debut of Jonah Hill. And he also wrote the screenplay to this film. And if I'm not mistaken, Jonah Hill, as far as I know, has not written a screenplay other than this one. Let me just double check that. He's written a number of stories for the screen, such as he wrote the story for 21 and 22 Jump Street, as well as contributed to the story of Sausage Party and Why Him. Both those movies came out in 2016, but he hasn't actually written a screenplay for any movies as of yet, but up until this one. But it's a very impressive directorial debut by Jonah Hill. It's not a perfect movie, but it's still a very good start, and I actually would love to see what Jonah Hill directs next. So, as the title of the movie suggests, Mid-90s takes place in the mid-90s in 1990 era Los Angeles. You're not told exactly what year this movie takes place, but it definitely takes place no later than 1996. And it follows Stevie, who is a 13-year-old who lives in 1990s era Los Angeles, who spends his summer navigating between his troubled home life and a group of new friends that he meets at a Motor Avenue skate shop. And the character Stevie is played by a young actor by the name of Sonny Suljic, who I'm told is an American child actor and a skateboarder. Before mid-90s, he played a role in a movie called Killing of a Sacred Deer, which came out last year, but despite the fact that I was hosting the show and saw literally hundreds of movies last year, I did not see the movie Killing of a Sacred Deer. But after this movie, I'm definitely going to look out for him. And this movie resonates with me particularly because in the mid-90s, I was in my early teens. In fact, I turned 13 in 1995, and I can certainly relate to a number of things I had to deal with as an early adolescent in this movie. Of course, I grew up in a small town, not an area like Los Angeles. So if I wanted to go somewhere, I couldn't skateboard there. I had to ask my parents. But in terms of having a bullying older brother, yeah, I've been there. I mean, my brother and I get along great now, but our relationship hasn't always been perfect, but that is another story. I can tell you, however, that the older brother in this film, whose name is Ian, who's played by Academy Award nominee Lucas Hedges, is really intense in this film. As a matter of fact, there are several scenes where Ian and Stevie are in the same scene, and what Ian does to his younger brother Stevie does not border on child abuse. It is child abuse. There's something really off about Ian, and you're not told or even shown what that is. In fact, a vast majority of this movie is told from the perspective of Stevie. And you also know a little bit about Stevie's mother, Dabney, who's played in this movie by Catherine Waterston. And there is a history behind the character of Dabney. And again, it's not told, and it's shown in some instances, and particularly reflected upon by her sons, Ian and Stevie, but you're not given a backstory. All you know is that they have a father who's absent from their life. Whether or not the mother, Dabney, was married to this man, you really don't know. And you also know that they're not poor, but they're lower middle class. But either way, Stevie's home life is hectic. And eventually he finds himself trying to get to a rite of passage in the form of these I shouldn't say gang, but a group of skateboarding kids, including Ray, who's played by Nakel Smith, who's the leader of the group, and I think the best actor in this movie. Another character whose name I can't say on the radio, who's played by Olin Prenot. There's Ruben, who's played by Gio Galicia. And there's also another relatively mute character named Fourth Grade, who's played by Ryder McLaughlin. And I can't exactly get into the personalities of all these characters. They do certainly have unique personalities, but I can't really elaborate upon them right now. But I can tell you that Nakel Smith, who plays Ray, is definitely the leader of the group, and also a really good guy once you get to know him. When I was watching this film, I was certainly reminded of the movie Kids in terms of the fact that this movie is about skateboarders, and it's shot in a lot of the same kinds of ways that Larry Clark shot Kids. However, this movie is a little bit more uplifting than Kids. Kids, the movie from 1995, to me felt like being hit over the head over and over again by a blunt object. It's not a very pleasant film to watch. It feels like a documentary, even though it's fiction. And this movie, mid-90s, very much like Kids, has written dialogue that you wouldn't think when the actors are saying the dialogue is actually written, but it is a really good film. And I also, it reminded me very much of another film that came out in the early aughts, which is called This Is England, which of course is a British film about a young kid who's trying to get into the good graces of a gang of skinheads. Of course, the actors in this film are not skinheads, but they do smoke and drink and have promiscuous sex. So in that instance, they're not exactly the best influence, but the more you get to know the characters in the movie, the more they are relatable, real, and maybe not as bleak or as destined for failure the same way most of the kids in the movie Kids were. But as I said, really enjoyed the film. It certainly is a slice of life movie in that there's not really a story going on, but it is very character driven. And fortunately, just about everyone in this movie acts incredibly well. In fact, there are moments, not just because it took place in the mid-90s, which I experienced, but there are moments in the film, particularly being an early adolescent like I was, that I could certainly relate to, especially when Stevie and Dabney, the mother and son, get into a heated argument in a car. That brings back some childhood memories, not particularly pleasant ones, but again, I'm not going to spoil too much about mid-90s. It is certainly experience. I will admit that I liked the movie Eighth Grade, which is a similarly themed movie, although it takes place in a different time. I like that a little bit better, but mid-90s still gets my rating of a knockout because it is a very impressive debut directorially by Jonah Hill. He certainly knows how to direct actors, too.
Adopt US Kids presents What to Expect When You're Expecting a Teenager. Learning the lingo.
Hundo P. Hundo P. Adjective. Short for being 100% sure or certain. As in, if we get a puppy, I'll Hundo P always walk it.
You don't have to speak teen to be a perfect parent. Thousands of teens in foster care will love you just the same. Visit adoptuskids.org. Brought to you by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Adopt U.S. Kids, and the Ad Council.
Next Wednesday, we have Reverb Nation artist Karen Grenner up on Joe Vig's Pop Explosion, where they will be talking about her latest single, album, and so much more. Tune in next Wednesday for Karen Grenner, Reverb Nation artist highlight of the week.
Welcome back to Words on Film, the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures. I'm your host and movie critic, Dan Burke. The next movie I'm going to be reviewing for you is Johnny English Strikes Again, which is where Rowan Atkinson comes back as Johnny English for the third time. And unfortunately, I am getting a little bit of technical difficulties here, if you'll excuse me for just a second. But the movie Johnny English Strikes Again is Rowan Atkinson returning as Johnny English for the third time, Johnny English being a spy for British intelligence. And he is put on a mission, even though he is semi-retired from British intelligence, because he is one of the only agents that the MI7 has that is not detectable by a hacker who has hacked the British intelligence mainframe, thereby exposing all secret agents potentially to the world. So now my internet is working again. Okay, great. So let me give you a more elaborate plot of Johnny English Strikes Again. As I said, it is the second sequel to 2003's Johnny English, and after a cyber attack reveals the identity of all the active undercover agents in Britain, Johnny English, reprised again here by Rowan Atkinson, is forced to come out of retirement to find the mastermind hacker. The screenplay and the story were both written by William Davies, who I believe has written other Johnny English films. Again, this is the third in the series, and it's not exactly as clever, I don't think, as the original Johnny English, and I have not seen the sequel to Johnny English, which was Johnny English Reborn, which came out 8 years after the original Johnny English movie. This film, of course, came 7 years after Johnny English Reborn, but even though you had Emma Thompson in this movie as the Prime Minister, I just felt as though this movie thematically ripped off the first Kingsman movie, Kingsman: The Secret Service. But I didn't really feel like it was a necessary sequel, and also I just didn't think the gags were as funny or as clever as at least the first Johnny English movie or any of the Mr. Bean movies or TV shows that Rowan Atkinson has done. Again, the plot was a little bit predictable, and also the gags, I thought some of them worked, some of them made me laugh out loud, but there were others that fell kind of flat. But I do have to say that even though I kind of knew that Johnny English was going to win in the end, and that's not really a spoiler, I bet you guys probably knew that going into the film, I did actually think that the climax had a little bit of uniqueness, but again, when comparing this movie to Kingsman: The Secret Service, particularly where you have a villain who's this Steve Jobs-like Silicon Valley billionaire that, guess what, wants to take over the world, and that billionaire, by the way, is played by, well, okay, the internet's working now, so again, had a little bit of a scare there. But this, again, this Silicon Valley tech billionaire is played by Jake Lacy, who I who I think is a pretty good actor. This is the first time I've actually seen him in a villainous role, and he does relatively well. But again, the comparisons between his character and Samuel L. Jackson's character in Kingsman: The Secret Service are a little bit too predictable, a little bit too noteworthy. Or rather, I should say, you know what I mean. Anyway, I apologize for the technical difficulties here, but again, there's really not much else to say about Johnny English Strikes Again, but I have about 3 minutes more to talk about it. So, Johnny English, as I said in this movie, is retired and actually working as a school teacher. And I actually thought that the teaching scenes where he is teaching his young pupils about how to spy were probably the most inspired parts of this film. In fact, those were the parts that made me laugh out loud the most. As a matter of fact, it makes me wonder why the film wasn't just about Johnny English teaching the next generation of spies how to spy. I thought that would have been very clever, putting Rowan Atkinson in a position where he is teaching, and even though he is actually good at doing things like disappearing by way of camouflage and also using equipment, I thought there could have been a lot of other comedic possibilities for Johnny English to seemingly do things right. But again, when he's in the classroom and he's doing these gags, even when they go right, just as he intended, it's funny. But when unfortunately he is out in the field and doing his spy work, the movie can't really seem to decide whether he's supposed to be smart but clumsy or dumb but happy-go-lucky. And the movie just doesn't really seem to want to decide, and it really depends on the scene and what the director seems to want Johnny English to be, either a bumbling idiot or somebody who kind of knows what he's doing but is just clumsy. It doesn't really seem to get that. And I think that in the first Johnny English movie, Rowan Atkinson, as well as, not to mention, the screenplay writer, seemed to have a better handle on who Johnny English was, and also some of the pratfalls that result because of his clumsiness and his ineptitude. But in this movie, the movie can't really decide what it wants Johnny English to be, which is why Johnny English Strikes Again is not a terrible film, but it gets my rating of a strikeout because it is comically inept. There are scenes that work, there are some that don't, and there are even scenes where Johnny English is trapped in a situation, but then the next scene sees him untrapped. And I would think that with this movie, it would actually be kind of funny to see Johnny English try to get himself out of a tight situation. Here he is stuck between a rock and a hard place. It would be funny to see him actually clumsily get out of this position. But unfortunately, the movie seemed to emphasize the plot, which is too similar to Kingsman: The Secret Service, over some of the gags that could have been even funnier than they were. But no fault on Rowan Atkinson himself.
Imagine being fired because of who you love. Imagine being denied medical treatment because of who you marry. Imagine being evicted because of who you are. Millions of Americans don't have to imagine this. They have to live it. Because in 31 states, it's legal to discriminate against LGBT people. Get the facts at beyondido.org. Brought to you by the Gill Foundation and the Ad Council.
From the birthplace of the American Revolution, Boston, Massachusetts. It's all about free speech, free speech. BostonFreeRadio.com.
Hey, it's Genevieve, a.k.a. Miss Fab 617.
And it's your girl, Crystal, a.k.a. The Crystal Lens.
We're coming to you from our new show called
Boston Come Through. We'll be bringing you the latest and greatest things happening in and around Boston. We'll be talking what? Black-owned businesses, social events, what? And the Black experience. How's that sound, Genevieve?
I love it.
Dig it.
Tune in every Wednesday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time on Boston Free Radio.
Boston, come through. Come listen.
Welcome back to Words on Film on the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures. I'm your host and movie critic, Dan Burke. The next movie I'm going to be reviewing for you is Indivisible, which is a Christian drama film released by PureFlix. And I went into this movie not knowing too much about it. I kind of figured it was a religious film, but once I saw PureFlix in the opening credits, I sighed a little bit because PureFlix, even though it releases movies with good intentions, hasn't been particularly good films that they've been releasing. They're the studio behind the God's Not Dead movies, amongst others, and God's Not Dead was a horribly preachy film. This film, even though it is a Christian drama film, is not especially preachy, and I think it does what any good movie about religion should do. In other words, it is a film that shows you how faith can be tested and how when things are not going particularly well in life, how even somebody who is a committed Christian can question their beliefs. And in Indivisible, this is the true story of Army Chaplain Darren Turner, who is a real person, but in this movie he's played by an actor named Justin Bruning. And it tells the story of him and his family, particularly his wife Heather. And this movie takes place in 2007 when the Iraq War is still raging and George W. Bush makes the controversial decision to send more troops into Baghdad, including this Army chaplain. And even though Army chaplains are not required or even expected to engage in combat, in other words, they're not expected to pick up a gun and fight, the Army chaplain still grapples with post-traumatic stress disorder as he comes home. And he faces one more battle when he comes home, the fight to save his marriage. One marriage, one family, under God. And that is the tagline of this film. It's directed and co-written by David G. Evans, who has directed actually only one film before this, one called The Grace Card from 2010. And he was also in charge of casting for that film. And The Grace Card is a religious Christian film, but it came out long before the first God's Not Dead, when Christian films were not expected to make any money at the box office. But God's Not Dead became a sleeper hit, and certainly not the first Christian drama sleeper hit, even though it was not a particularly good movie. But Indivisible does tell a moving story, and I was actually impressed by the acting performances in this movie by Justin Bruning, who plays Chaplain Darren Turner, and also his wife, who's played by Sarah Drew. I liked both their performances, but one of the things that I didn't quite get about this movie, and I will acknowledge that I never served in the military, so I'm not exactly sure if I should be critiquing a film that's set in Iraq for being accurate, but I know that soldiers who have come home from Iraq and Afghanistan experience post-traumatic stress disorder like other veterans in wars that have taken place before us. But I would imagine that somebody as high-ranking as an Army chaplain would experience post-traumatic stress disorder, no doubt about that, because he actually is going with other combat troops into war zones. Even though he's not expected to pick up a vehicle, he still sees the traumas of war. But I would imagine that somebody as high-ranking as an Army chaplain would be immediately treated for post-traumatic stress disorder, or at least be taken to a psychologist for that disorder, almost immediately. As in, the Army wouldn't take any risks on having one of their high-ranking officials experience PTSD. But then again, I could be wrong. Somebody who has experience in the military could probably tell me otherwise, but in this movie, it seemed at least a little bit to me like his PTSD and the effect it had on his marriage and his relationship with his family served only as a plot device and not really much else. And even though this is based on a true story about an Army chaplain, I don't know if his PTSD experiences were traumatic or what have you, but I will say that the scenes where Justin Bruning's character had PTSD were a lot more convincing and actually a lot scarier than the other recent Christian drama film, Unbroken Path to Redemption, where the PTSD scenes in that film were so hokey and made it look like a cheap horror film rather than something that a soldier experiences coming home from war. I've gotten more an idea of what PTSD feels like in movies like Born on the 4th of July or Dead Presidents, movies about combat veterans who come home and struggle with civilian life, than I did with the unofficial sequel to Unbroken, which we should probably just disown because it wasn't that great a film. But with that said, I did learn a lot from Indivisible, particularly about the role of an Army chaplain. And I also was impressed with some of the supporting performances in this film. One of the performances that stuck with me the most was the one from an actress named Sky P. Marshall, who's a woman who plays Sergeant Shonda Peterson in this film. And it's not clear whether her character is real or if she is somebody who was created for this film. In other words, a composite character. But I did like Sky P. Marshall's performance in this film. It's not often you see films where women are war heroes in combat zones. In fact, Indivisible might be the very first movie I've seen with such a character, but I did enjoy Marshall's performance. Some of the other acting performances in the movie, like that of Tia Mowry Hardrick, were a little iffy at times, but overall I enjoyed the film, and it gets my rating of a checkout because it's a film that's not preachy, and despite the dubious scenes of post-traumatic stress disorder, even though PTSD is convincing in this film, I'm not convinced that somebody who's an Army chaplain would be necessarily allowed to just go home without some sort of treatment.
180 over 111, and I had a stroke. I couldn't speak or walk.
150 over 90, and I had a stroke.
This is what high blood pressure sounds like. You might not feel its symptoms, but the results from a stroke are far from silent. Get back on your treatment plan or talk with your doctor to create a plan that works for you. Go to loweryourhbp.org.
Head to toe, everything's changed.
Brought to you by the American Stroke Association, American Medical Association, and the Ad Council.
Welcome back to Words on Film, the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures. I'm your host and movie critic, Dan Burke. The next movie I'm going to be reviewing for you is Can You Ever Forgive Me?, which is a true story about a writer by the name of Lee Israel, and that is her real name, who falls out of step with current tastes, and after struggling to get her biography published about a vaudeville performer named Fanny Bryce, she decides to turn her art form, writing, into deception. And it is an adaptation of a memoir of the same name that Lee Israel actually wrote. And in the movie Can You Ever Forgive Me?, Melissa McCarthy plays Lee Israel. And let's talk about Melissa McCarthy for a second. She still is a big name in movies. She's an A-lister, but 2018, I just saw the year 2016 and got a little thrown off. This year, 2018, hasn't been a great year for Melissa McCarthy. She was in a movie called Life of the Party, which was a modest hit, but didn't receive great reviews. It got a decent review from me, but again, I acknowledge, like other critics do, the similarities between Life of the Party and Rodney Dangerfield's Back to School. She was also in a movie this past summer called The Happy Time Murders, which I liked more than most people, but even still, it was a commercial and critical flop. So, Can You Ever Forgive Me might be a film that could potentially resuscitate Melissa McCarthy's bad year, but it is unlikely that this film will break box office records, especially given its subject matter. But in any event, I do think it is a strong performance by Melissa McCarthy, who is funny in this film, but not funny in the same way she's been in other films like Bridesmaids. But I think this is a film, certainly a true story that is absurd, but it's not one that's unbelievable, like Life of the Party or The Happy Time Murders. So I think Melissa McCarthy sort of earns your sympathies in some ways, but also she plays someone who is decidedly unlikable. As a matter of fact, a lot of the misfortunes that Lee Israel goes through in this film, she kind of brings upon herself. But Melissa McCarthy is fortunately enough of an underdog in this film for you to root for her. She also has a friend who's she treats poorly. His name is Jack Hawk, who also is a real person and a real writer, who's played in this movie endearingly by Richard E. Grant. And when Lee Israel is not able to get an advance for her book about a vaudeville performer named Fanny Bryce, and her agent, Marjorie, who's played by Jane Curtin in this film, who also is very good in this film, suggests that Melissa McCarthy does something else to make a living, Lee Israel finds a number of artifacts from the real Fanny Bryce, real letters that she wrote and also signed, that she finds she can actually sell to used bookstores for a healthy profit. It's then that she gets the idea to fabricate letters that certain people like Fanny Bryce or Noel Coward or Dorothy Parker wrote way back when. In other words, deceased auteurs have written. And she actually finds that she can go to these old vintage bookstores and people will pay her for these letters. Well, unfortunately, this is illegal. I mean, it's funny that Lee Israel is able to do this and able to bring herself back up from her bootstraps, but at the same time, what she's doing is obviously wrong. And the movie does get interesting as it gets into some of the relationships that Lee Israel finds herself getting into, for better or for worse, including one seemingly flirtatious relationship with a woman named Anna, who's played in this movie by Dolly Wells. She is a vintage book owner with whom Melissa McCarthy's character begins a friendship, and eventually that kind of develops into something a little more. But of course, things get really complicated when the FBI gets involved in this scheme that Melissa McCarthy's character is cooking up. But it is a really fascinating movie to show that before the internet, that somebody could actually get away with such forgeries and fabrications. And it is interesting to see somebody as frumpy and as unskilled as, or semi-unskilled in terms of thievery, as Melissa McCarthy's character is in this film, is able to get away with what she does for so long. And it is pretty funny as the film progresses. And I think unlike Life of the Party or even The Happy Time Murders, Melissa McCarthy is funny in this film without putting out too much of an effort, without seeming as desperate for laughs as she's been in some of her later comedies. Of course, I'm not including Bridesmaids or even Ghostbusters, which I liked a lot better than other people did, but I actually commend Melissa McCarthy a lot for expanding her acting abilities and probably taking a risk in playing somebody in this movie who is not especially likable, but you somehow find yourself rooting for her, even though you know that this is a true story and she will eventually get caught. You still want to see how she gets caught. You also want to see how her complicated relationship with Jack Hawk, a gay man who has his share of troubles, how that's going to pan out as well. So Can You Ever Forgive Me is not a sexy film, but it is an intriguing film, and it gets my rating actually of a knockout. I do think it's one of Melissa McCarthy's best performances that she's ever turned in, and she chose a great topic or a great true story in which to stretch her acting talent. And her husband, Ben Falcone, actually appears in this movie in a significant role, but unlike his other directorial efforts with Melissa McCarthy, he doesn't seem to bring her down in this film, and I think that's all for the best. And Can You Ever Forgive Me is certainly a film you may not want to see on the big screen, but you definitely want to check it out when it comes on streaming.
In the wake of a disaster, what one thing can you send that will help people the most? A blanket, a tent, a sandbag, a doctor. Actually, if you send a monetary donation, you send all these things. Even a small donation can make a big impact and can quickly become exactly what people affected by disaster need most.
In the wake of a hurricane, your monetary donation can make a huge difference to those in need. To donate, visit supporthurricanerelief.org. That's supporthurricanerelief.org. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Every Tuesday at 3, something special happens on Boston Free Radio. Why, it's Toppers with your host, Gil. Toppers, spinning the tunes that today's youth demand, from Justin Bieber to Lady Gaga to the Fleetwoods, and, on occasion, Hoagie Carmichael. If you missed the program, you can check out the archives at Toppers Radio, that's one word, .blogspot.com. Toppers.
Welcome back to Words on Film, the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures. I'm your host and movie critic, Dan Burke. And now that I've reviewed all the films that I said I'd be reviewing for this show, it's now time for my final segment, which is What's Coming Up Next. This is a spoken word previews of movies that may or may not be coming to theaters near you, but they will be coming out in some capacity this coming weekend. Usually the first films I mentioned are the ones that will be coming out in a theater near you, and the movie The Nutcracker and the Four Realms is no exception. It's a movie about a young girl who is transported into a magical world of gingerbread soldiers and an army of mice. It is, of course, based on the Tchaikovsky ballet, but, of course, has a narrative twist to it. The lead actress in the movie is a young actress named Mackenzie Foy, whom I had never heard of, but she is only 17 years old. She'll be 18 on November 10th of this year. Actually, she was the voice of the little girl in the underrated Netflix animated movie The Little Prince, which I recommend you check out. It's still on Netflix if you want to see that. She was unfortunately in one of the Twilight movies. She was also in The Conjuring, which I haven't seen, and she played a small role in Interstellar when she was around 10 years old. Well, her character was supposed to be 10 years old in that movie, but she was 13 or 14 when the movie was filming. But the movie also co-stars Keira Knightley, Morgan Freeman, and Helen Mirren. And this is a movie I'll definitely be seeing. It's certainly a movie just in time for Christmas. And I will let you know what I think come next week's show. Another highly anticipated movie that's coming out in theaters this coming weekend is Bohemian Rhapsody, which I would predict would be number 1 at the box office, but I would imagine that it will probably be number 2 at the box office, and Nutcracker will be number 1 next week. That's my prediction. But Bohemian Rhapsody is a biography, a biopic, about the years leading up to Queen's legendary appearance at the Live Aid concert. It is directed by Bryan Singer, who directed a number of X-Men films as well as great movies like The Usual Suspects. And Rami Malek plays Freddie Mercury in this film. And there are another number of other relative unknowns in the movie, although ones that have actually a lot of acting experience, including Joseph Mazzello, who played the boy in the original Jurassic Park movie. He's in this film. Lucy Boynton is also in this movie. And Bohemian Rhapsody is a film I will undoubtedly see, and I will let you know what I think come next week's show. Another movie that's coming out in theaters this coming weekend, in theaters worldwide, I would imagine, or at least nationwide, is one called Nobody's Fool, which is not the movie starring Paul Newman. Of course, since Paul Newman's dead, there's no way to put him in a film. Why did I say that? Moving on. This version of Nobody's Fool is directed by Tyler Perry and is written by him too, and it's about a woman who is released from prison and reunites with her sister, and she soon discovers that her sister is in an online relationship with a man who may not be what he seems. Now, the movie, despite being directed by Tyler Perry, is not a Medea film, which is great, which is why I'm going to give this movie a chance. And this is a movie I will see, by the way, but let me give you a little bit of information about it. The woman in this movie who's released from prison is played by Tiffany Haddish, and her sister is played by the underrated actress Tika Sumpter, who I've been watching for a while now, especially when she's been in movies like South Side with Me, which should have earned her an Oscar nomination for playing the woman who would become Michelle Obama. But I'm glad to see her in movies, especially in films where she is actually given at least second billing. She was also in The Old Man and the Gun, but her role was somewhat small in that film. But Nobody's Fool, I don't have high expectations for this movie, considering that it's directed by Tyler Perry. But with Tiffany Haddish and Tika Sumpter in the lead roles, it does have some promise. So I'm going to see it, and I will review it for you come next week's show. Another movie that's coming out in theaters, albeit in limited release, is a highly anticipated movie called Boy Erased. This is a movie about the son of a Baptist preacher who is forced to participate in a church-supported gay conversion program after being forcibly outed to his parents. This sounds like a really good film. It does sound, of course, thematically like The Miseducation of Cameron Post, which boasted a strong performance by Chloe Grace Moretz. But in Boy Erased, Lucas Hedges, the Academy Award nominee from Manchester by the Sea, is in this film, along with Nicole Kidman, Joel Edgerton, and Russell Crowe. So this looks promising. Hopefully it's coming out in a theater near me. If it is, I'll review it for you next week. But that just about wraps things up with this edition of Words on Film. I'm your host and movie critic, Dan Burke, and just as a reminder, the views and opinions expressed on Words on Film about movies or otherwise are solely those of your host and movie critic, Dan Burke. They do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of any employees who are working at the station airing this broadcast or the station as a whole. And this is Dan Burke saying, I'll see you at the movies.